Hi guys, welcome to Code Patch, and in this video I will discuss about eloquent model scopes. So scopes are basically or the constants which are applied to the queries which we run on a specific model. So there are two types of scopes: global scopes and local scopes. The difference between them is uh, the global scopes are applied on every query which we run on a specific model, but the local scopes are the subject to use whenever we want to use it. Okay, so let's move on to the first of all the global scope. The, to create a global scope, uh, uh, we use one of the two methods. First one is by creating a class, and second one is by declaring it anonymously. So let's move on to the by creating a class example first. So under the app folder, I will create a scopes folder. Okay. Just keep in mind, you can keep your scopes anywhere in your folder structure, but for the sake of simplicity, I am declaring it here, okay, in parallel to my models. Okay, I will use the post model, and it related to the posts table, and it has the status column also, and we will play around this status column. Okay, by defining the constant on this column. So I have two records, and one has a status one, and second one is a zero. Okay. So under the scopes folder, I will create a new class, new scopes class. I'm going to define a constant on status. So I will name it by status scope. Okay, like this. To create a scope class, your scope class must implement the eloquent scope interface. Okay, so let's include it first. Okay, and if you check this interface, the eloquent scope interface, it has only one method, apply. So we need to just implement this apply method in our class. Okay, so let's quickly create a class status, our scope class. Let's copy this method from here. Like this, and we need to also include these dependencies, builder and model, and using the builder instance we create our constants. So let's copy this inclusion also the top like this. Okay. And under this method just simply using the builder instance create the condition to filter out the result. Okay, we are creating the status scope that that returns the result with the status one only. So in our case, we will get only one record out of two. To apply to our post model, we need to include first it in our model, post model. Okay, so okay, and the second thing you need to do is to create the booted method of model. Okay, like this. And in this booted method, uh, we need to define the statement to use our status scope. So there is a static method add global scope, and in this method we need to provide the instance of our created scope class like this. And now we are good to go. So when we query any query on this post model fetch query, then this scope class will automatically be applied on the query. And as we have declared the constant here to filter out only status with one value. Okay, so for this let's use the thinker. You can check out my thinker video uh, I have created earlier. Okay, so thinker basically a command line interface for the Laravel. So let's do it to full screen. Okay, and uh, okay, and we are querying for the all the records on the post model, and it returns only with the status one. Okay, and if we comment out our applied scope like this. Okay, and now we need to re-enter in it thinker. Now we get all the records. So you can see clearly how these scopes are very useful. Okay. Uh, you can also exclude this scope when you query on this model manually. Like, let me re-enter in it first. And now we are getting only one record because we have uncomment our status scope. And if we want to uh, query without any scope, we can using the without global scope function. Scopes, just keep in mind as here. Okay, without global scopes, this method will escape out all the applied global scopes on this model. Now if we enter, we will get all the records. Okay, the other version, to escape out the specific scope, you need to use without global scope function. Okay, and in this method you need to pass the scope, the specific scope you want to skip out. So in our case, we have status scope. Okay, and now uh, it skip our status scope and returns all the record. Okay, so using these two methods, without global scope and without global scopes function, you can skip out any applied global scope on the specific model. Okay, so we have created the scope class first. Okay, and implement the scope interface, and then implement this apply method, and define the constant here. Then on the model, uh, we have included our status scope on the top. Okay, here, and then the model booted method. Under the booted method, we use the static add global scope function, and in this function we have passed the passed our status scope instance. Okay, the other method to declare the global scope, uh, as I have told earlier, we can create the anonymously on the spot. Okay, so let's comment it out and try to define it anonymously. So static add global scope. Okay, in this add global scope method, if we want to define the global scope anonymously, the first parameter will be the scope name. So in our case, uh, we are going to define the status scope. Okay, and then the second will be the closure function. Okay, and this closure function will have the builder instance. To use the builder instance, we need to include it at the top first. So let's copy it here from it here. Okay, and using this builder instance, we can define our constant. So let's copy the constant as well, like this, and define it here. Okay, and now let's for the sake of difference, let's change it to the 0. So we are creating the status scope anonymously that will return only the post with the status 0. Okay, so let's move on to our thinker interface. We need to re-enter in first. Okay, now if we apply the get method on this post model, we are getting only a single record with the status 0. Okay, so the difference between the if you want to skip this specific anonymous uh, scope, uh, as we have done earlier in the for the class type of global scope, we need to mention here the scope key instead of instance, because we don't have any instance and we have created it anonymously, but we have here the scope key here. So we will use here like this. Okay, and now we are getting all the record. Okay, so we can create the global scope using these two, uh, either of these two methods, by creating a class or declare it anonymously. And uh, when you if you want to use your scope multiple times, then you should create a class. And if you want to use a single time only, then you can create declare it anonymously. But please prefer the class method. It is a more sophisticated way and flexible way to extend the scope. Okay, and keep it your code dry. Okay, so this is all about the global scope. Let's move on to the local scope. So let's comment it out first. To create a local scope, we need to define uh, the scope function in the model itself. We don't need to define the separate class for that. Okay, so every scope function in the model must have the prefix scope. Okay, so in our case, if we want to define the local status scope, okay, so just prefixes with the scope, okay, and the scope name status. And in this method, you need to pass the query instance like this. Okay, so using this query instance, we can we can declare the constant for the query like this. Okay. Okay, so these local scope will not be applied automatically on every query you run on this model, but you need to declare use it manually on the queries you are running on this model. So let's move on to our thinker interface, and we need to re-enter it because we have changed our code. Okay, and if we use the get, we are getting all the records. As local scope will not be applied automatically. To use the local scope, we need to mention the scope name, parenthesis, and then get. Okay, okay. Now we are getting the result by applying the scope, local scope. Okay, so in this way we are free to use our local scope on when we are querying to a specific model. Your local scope can be parameterized. Okay, suppose you want to pass the status dynamically. So if you want to pass the parameter, then after the query instance, uh, you need to the other uh, parameter will be declared after the query instance. Okay, so in this case we want to pass the status also dynamically. Okay, so in this way we can filter out our result dynamically by passing the status in the local scope. Okay, so let's re-enter into thinker and pass the status 1, and we are getting the result with the status 1. Okay, and if we pass the status 0, we are getting the result with the status 0. Okay, so these are the very useful can say constant method. Okay, the local scope and the global scope. The local scope are specifically to the model, but the global scope you can use in the several model. Suppose you have a status field or any other column common to the into the multiple model. Okay, so or you want to define the common constant on this on the different multiple models, then you can define the global scope and use it multiple times. And if you have the constant is specific to the model, then use the local scope. Okay, suppose it is clear now. Okay, so thanks for watching this video, and please subscribe our channel.